The night was quiet in Inverness, Florida, a peaceful town where people left their doors unlocked, trusting that crime was something that happened elsewhere. The warm air was still, thick with the scent of summer, and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustling of tree branches. Most of the town's residents had already settled into their beds, lost in dreams of another ordinary day ahead. But in one particular house, nestled at the end of a dimly lit road, something unspeakable had just taken place. The call came in at just past midnight. The 911 dispatcher picked up, expecting the usual noise complaints or medical emergencies. Instead, what she heard sent chills down her spine. "My mom." The voice on the other end was shaky, uneven, like the caller was struggling to breathe. "She's been murdered." A pause. The dispatcher's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Can you repeat that?" "She's dead. There's blood everywhere." The boy's voice cracked, and in the background, muffled sobs filled the silence. Within minutes, the dispatcher had officers en route. As the police cruisers pulled up to the modest house, red and blue lights flashing against the white walls, the front door stood ajar. It was as if someone had left it open in a daze, too overwhelmed to think about anything else. The officers approached cautiously, their hands instinctively hovering near their holsters. From inside, the sound of a boy's ragged breathing could be heard. Carlos Hallowell stood frozen in the dimly lit living room, his body hunched, his face pale under the flickering overhead light. He was 17, just a kid, but something about his expression was unsettling. His wide, bloodshot eyes darted back and forth as if trying to make sense of a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He wasn't screaming, wasn't crying. He just stood there, clutching his arms, as if holding himself together. The lead officer stepped inside, flashlight beams slicing through the darkness. "Where's your mother?" Carlos slowly turned, his lips trembling as he pointed down the hall. "She's in her room." The officers moved forward, their boots heavy against the wooden floor. The moment they entered the bedroom, the scent of blood hit them like a punch to the gut. It was thick, metallic, suffocating. The body lay still on the bed, half covered by a now crimson blanket. Denise Hallowell had been attacked in her sleep. The blows had been relentless, savage. Deep gashes marked her skull, her body still as the darkness around her. There was no sign of a struggle, no desperate attempt to flee, only the horrific evidence of a brutal, merciless assault. Blood had soaked into the sheets, pooling on the floor in dark, drying stains. One of the officers turned away, swallowing back bile. A crime of passion? That was the first thought that came to mind. This wasn't a botched robbery or a random break-in. This was personal. The kind of crime where rage overtook reason, where someone didn't just want the victim dead, they wanted them destroyed. They searched the room, but there were no signs of forced entry, no shattered windows, no broken locks. The house was undisturbed. The lead detective, Daniel Brooks, exhaled sharply and turned back toward the boy in the living room. "What happened, Carlos?" Carlos didn't answer immediately. His fingers twitched slightly, his nails digging into the fabric of his sweatpants. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. I was sleeping." His breath came in short bursts. "Then I heard the dogs barking. I got up, went to check, and I found her like that." His eyes flickered toward the officers, desperate, pleading, but something felt off. No intruder, no signs of struggle, nothing missing. Then where was the weapon? A murder this brutal required something strong, heavy, a bat, a crowbar, a blade. But the crime scene was clean. Too clean. Brooks narrowed his eyes, scanning the room again. A house like this should have had some sign of a struggle, some overturned furniture, a misplaced object. But nothing seemed out of place. Everything was where it should have been, except for the body. He looked at Carlos again. The boy's hands trembled slightly, though whether from fear or something else, it was hard to tell. His face was pale, but there was no blood on his clothes, no cuts, no bruises. Yet something in his expression was distant, as if he were watching this unfold from behind a glass wall. Another officer stepped in from outside, shaking his head. No footprints, no tire tracks leading away from the house, so whoever did this either teleported in and out or never left. Brooks took a deep breath. The pieces weren't fitting together. Not yet. But one thing was clear. This wasn't the work of a stranger. It was someone close. Someone who had the time, the opportunity, and, most importantly, the motive. The night was no longer quiet. It was full of unanswered questions. And somewhere in this house, buried beneath the weight of fear and grief, lay the truth. A truth that would soon come to light. The house, once a home, now felt like a crime scene frozen in time. Every corner, every shadow seemed to whisper a story that hadn't yet been fully uncovered. Officers moved in synchronized silence, cameras flashing as forensic specialists dusted surfaces, collecting fragments of a story that had ended in unspeakable violence. The body of Denise Hallowell remained on the bed, surrounded by the echoes of her final moments. Blood, thick and drying, clung to the fabric of the sheets, creating patterns that told a story of relentless force. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted her dead. They had wanted to ensure there was no coming back. Detective Daniel Brooks took another slow look around the room. He had been in this profession long enough to recognize when something didn't fit. And this didn't fit. No sign of forced entry. No clear weapon. Nothing out of place except for the brutalized body on the mattress. Brooks stepped out into the hall, where Carlos still sat, shoulders hunched, fingers intertwined so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His body language screamed distress, but Brooks wasn't sure yet if it was grief or something else. A murder like this? It was personal, it was emotional, and it wasn't the kind of crime a stranger could commit and walk away unnoticed. The lead forensic technician approached, his gloved hands holding a tablet displaying early findings. No signs of a break-in. The house was locked from the inside. No signs of struggle either. No defensive wounds on the victim. She never had a chance to fight back. Brooks frowned. That meant she was unconscious or asleep when the attack began. His gut tightened. That narrowed down the possibilities even further. Any sign of the murder weapon? The technician shook his head. Nothing yet, but the wounds indicate a sharp, heavy object. Maybe an axe or a hatchet. Brooks exhaled. So we're looking for something big enough to do that kind of damage, but small enough to be hidden. His gaze flickered back toward Carlos, who had remained silent for the past several minutes. The boy's shoulders trembled slightly, and his fingers twitched against the fabric of his shirt. Brooks had seen this kind of reaction before. Trauma could manifest in many ways: shock, denial, overwhelming sadness. But there was something in Carlos's stillness that felt too controlled. He had expected panic, tears, desperation. Instead, he was met with silence. Carlos had called 911. He had reported the murder. He had answered their questions. But was he telling them everything? Brooks crouched down beside the boy, lowering his voice. Carlos, listen to me. I know this is overwhelming, but we need to find out who did this to your mother. If you saw or heard anything at all, you need to tell us. Carlos inhaled sharply, his breath shaky. He licked his lips, his gaze darting toward the hall, as if the walls themselves might close in on him. I already told you, he murmured. I was asleep. I heard the dogs barking. And then I found her like that. Brooks studied him. The words sounded rehearsed, too precise, too safe. He pressed further. What time did you go to bed? Carlos hesitated. I don't know. Late. Maybe midnight. And you didn't hear anything? No movement? No voices? A pause. The flicker of something behind Carlos's eyes. Then he shook his head. Nothing. Brooks nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch between them. The human brain was a fascinating thing. Under extreme stress, memories blurred, timelines warped. People convinced themselves of things that weren't true, sometimes to protect themselves, sometimes because they simply couldn't face the truth. But something about Carlos's reaction wasn't just uncertainty, it was calculated. And that was the first red flag. Behind them, another officer emerged from the backyard, his boots caked with mud. He held something wrapped in plastic, a small, dark-stained cloth. We found this near the waterline out back, he said. It looks like a cleaning rag, might have blood on it. Brooks took the evidence bag, examining the cloth through the plastic. It was damp, stained in a way that suggested someone had tried to wipe something clean. The forensic technician took it, nodding. "We'll get this tested." Carlos's fingers clenched slightly against his jeans. A reaction so small it would have gone unnoticed if Brooks hadn't been watching for it. The detective stood, adjusting his coat. Something was wrong. They had a murder. They had a crime scene. But the story they were getting? It wasn't the full truth, and he intended to find out why. The house, once a quiet and safe space, was now the epicenter of a gruesome crime. Yellow police tape flapped gently in the humid Florida air as officers moved in and out, their voices hushed but urgent. The scene had become a carefully orchestrated chaos of forensic teams, detectives, and flashing cameras capturing every detail. But no matter how many angles they examined, the most pressing question remained. Who had killed Denise Hallowell? Detective Daniel Brooks watched as a group of forensic specialists worked meticulously over the bedroom, marking blood spatters, collecting fiber samples, and dusting for prints. He had been in law enforcement for long enough to know that the answer was rarely as simple as it seemed. The brutality of the crime suggested deep rage, but nothing about the crime scene felt impulsive. There was no struggle, no signs of panic or disorder. The weapon, likely a hatchet or an axe, was still missing, and that alone raised a red flag. Most crimes of passion didn't involve the calculated removal of the murder weapon. That required planning. Outside, a small group of neighbors had gathered behind the police barricade, murmuring to each other in hushed, concerned voices. A few of them knew Denise, at least in passing, a strict but dedicated woman, a former educator, a single mother who had adopted Carlos when he was younger, giving him a life far removed from whatever hardships he had faced before. Now they whispered about her fate in the way small-town communities always did when tragedy struck one of their own. Brooks turned his attention back to the house, stepping carefully through the rooms as he absorbed the details. The living room was tidy, untouched by the chaos that had unfolded just down the hall. A few framed photos rested on a bookshelf. Denise and Carlos at a school event, smiling in one. Another of Denise alone, standing proudly in front of a classroom whiteboard. Normal. Ordinary. And yet something about the house's eerie stillness gnawed at him. A murder like this should have left a greater impact. Denise should have fought, should have had the instinct to run, to call for help. Instead, she had died in her sleep, unaware of what was happening until it was too late. That told Brooks two things. The killer had known her well enough to strike without warning, and whoever had done it had made sure she couldn't resist. Brooks found Carlos still sitting in the same spot in the living room, a thin blanket wrapped around his shoulders. His body language remained tense, rigid, his hands pressed together in his lap. The forensic team had already checked him for any visible signs of injury. No blood on his clothes, no scratches or bruises. Physically, he was untouched, but emotionally, there was something unreadable in his face. Carlos had told them he'd been asleep when the attack happened, that the barking of the dogs had woken him, leading him to discover the horrific scene. It was a simple statement, one that on the surface made sense. But Brooks had learned to listen for the things people didn't say as much as the things they did. Carlos hadn't asked who could have done this. He hadn't expressed fear that the murderer was still out there. And that silence, intentional or not, was revealing. Brooks crouched slightly, keeping his voice even but firm. "Carlos, I know this is hard," he said carefully, "but I need to ask you again. Are you absolutely sure you didn't hear anything before the dog started barking? A noise? A voice?" Carlos hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but long enough for Brooks to notice. "No," he said finally, "I didn't hear anything." Brooks studied him for a moment, then nodded. He wouldn't press further. Not yet. Just then, an officer stepped inside from the backyard, holding something in a clear evidence bag. Brooks turned, his eyes narrowing as he took in the object. It was a shoe, a single, muddy shoe. "We found it near the back fence," the officer said. "Still damp. Size matches Carlos." Brooks took the bag, holding it up slightly. The shoe wasn't just muddy. It had been wet enough that the dirt had clung to it, meaning someone had stepped in damp ground before entering the house. And yet Carlos had told them he'd been inside all night. His gut told him they had just found their first real crack in the boy's story. Brooks exhaled, lowering the bag as his mind began to turn. The investigation was only beginning, but already things weren't adding up. The missing murder weapon, the eerie calm of the crime scene, and now a piece of evidence that suggested Carlos might not have been as asleep as he claimed. They weren't done here, not by a long shot, but the truth was beginning to slip through the cracks, and Brooks was determined to pull it into the light. The night stretched on, thick with the weight of something unspoken. The crime scene had long since been secured, but the house remained a tomb, frozen in the aftermath of brutality. The scent of blood still clung to the air, subtle but unmistakable, a metallic reminder of the violence that had unfolded just hours ago. Outside, the occasional burst of radio chatter from the officers stationed near the perimeter punctuated the silence. A murder like this didn't just shake a household, it rippled through an entire community. Detective Daniel Brooks stood in the doorway of Denise Hallowell's bedroom, his arms crossed as he surveyed the forensic team, combing over the last details. The stark glow of their flashlights illuminated the grisly scene, highlighting the dark stains that trailed down the mattress and pooled onto the hardwood floor. The body had been removed, but its absence didn't erase the horror of what had happened here. If anything, it made it feel even more surreal, as though a ghost still lingered in the air. The preliminary findings had confirmed what Brooks already suspected. Denise had been asleep when the first strike landed. There were no defensive wounds, no indication that she had woken up before the attack. That alone painted a grim picture of her final moments. No chance to scream, no time to process what was happening. Someone had made sure she never saw it coming. But Brooks wasn't just looking at the body. He was looking at the scene as a whole, piecing together the elements that didn't quite fit. The house was undisturbed. There was no forced entry. Nothing had been taken, nothing had been broken. If this had been a robbery gone wrong, there would have been some sign of struggle, some indication that the killer had rifled through her belongings. But everything was intact, except her life. Brooks turned his attention to the living room, where Carlos Hallowell still sat, motionless beneath the dim light. The boy's expression was a careful mask, unreadable except for the slight tension in his shoulders. He was wrapped in a blanket, a bottle of water untouched on the table beside him. He hadn't moved much since the police arrived, hadn't asked for anything, hadn't even looked at the bedroom door. Most people in his situation would have been inconsolable. A sudden, violent death like this left shock in its wake, but it also brought overwhelming emotion, grief, terror, rage. But Carlos was too still, too quiet. Brooks didn't press him again. Not yet. The investigation would unfold in layers, and right now there were other leads to follow. One of the officers approached, holding up the evidence bag with the muddy shoe inside. It was a simple thing, black, slightly worn at the soles, but what mattered wasn't the shoe itself. It was where they had found it. "We need to talk about this," Brooks said, taking the bag from the officer's hands. He turned it over slowly, watching how the light reflected off the damp stains. "Carlos told us he never left the house after he went to bed. But this?" He tapped the plastic. "This says otherwise." The officer nodded. "We checked the backyard. There's a narrow path leading from the back porch to the water. It rained earlier today, so the ground's still soft. Whoever walked through there left footprints." Brooks exhaled through his nose. That detail mattered. The yard was fenced in, the gate locked from the inside. If an outsider had come through, they would have left some evidence of forced entry. But no one had forced their way in, and yet someone had walked out. The implications were growing clearer by the second. Another officer entered the room carrying a laptop bag. "Sir, we have the victim's laptop. It was in the office." Brooks motioned for them to bring it over. Denise Hallowell had been a teacher, someone who likely kept meticulous records. If there was something on that computer, an email, a message, a note, it could give them insight into her final days. He sat at the dining table, flipping open the screen as a forensic analyst plugged in an external drive, preparing to extract files. The screen flickered to life, and within seconds, Denise's desktop appeared. A clean, organized layout, a few folders neatly arranged. But one caught Brooks's eye immediately, a document recently modified. He leaned in as the forensic analyst opened it. The file name was simple: Carlos. Brooks straightened, his pulse quickening as he read. The words on the screen weren't long, but they carried weight. Denise had been documenting something, a series of notes spanning weeks, entries that detailed frustration, concern, and something dangerously close to fear. Carlos has been distant lately, short-tempered. When I ask about school, he shuts down completely. There's an anger in him that I don't understand. I took his phone away today. He barely reacted, just stared at me. It scared me more than it should have. I woke up last night and saw him standing in the hallway. He didn't say anything, just stood there. When I asked what was wrong, he turned and walked away. Brooks inhaled sharply. This wasn't just an account of a difficult mother-son relationship. This was something else entirely. He scrolled further. I need to figure out what's going on with him before it's too late. The last entry had been saved just 2 days before Denise was killed. A cold weight settled in Brooks' stomach. This was the kind of evidence that shifted an investigation. Not a smoking gun, not direct proof, but it painted a picture, a pattern. A mother who had seen something coming, and a son who might have been at the center of it all. Brooks closed the laptop, pushing back from the table. The next steps were clear. They needed to dig deeper. They needed to find the weapon. They needed to retrace Carlos's steps that night. And most of all, they needed to find out what Denise had meant by before it's too late. Because she had been right. It had already been too late. The morning light did little to soften the brutality of the night before. Outside, the small town of Inverness was beginning to stir. Neighbors cautiously stepping onto porches, their eyes drifting toward the house that was now sealed behind police tape. Rumors would spread, theories would be whispered in coffee shops, and the horror of Denise Hallowell's murder would become a dark stain on the town's otherwise quiet history. Inside, however, the investigation had barely begun. Detective Daniel Brooks sat at the dining room table, the glow of Denise's laptop screen reflecting off his tired eyes. The house still carried the heavy silence of death, despite the movement of forensic technicians collecting samples, measuring distances, and mapping out the final moments of Denise's life. The crime scene had already revealed its fair share of disturbing details. No signs of forced entry, no defensive wounds, the eerie tidiness of the home aside from the blood-soaked bed. But the latest discovery was something else entirely. The document on Denise's computer had painted an unsettling picture. A mother watching her son change in ways she couldn't understand. A series of observations that hinted at something more than just teenage rebellion. Carlos has been distant. Carlos has been short-tempered. Carlos stood in the hallway last night watching me. He didn't say anything. It was that last entry that had settled uneasily in Brooks' mind. Denise had been afraid of something she couldn't quite name, but something that had been growing right in front of her. Had she seen it coming? Had she known deep down that the storm was already gathering inside her own home? Brooks scrolled back through the notes, searching for something, anything, that might offer more insight. There were no outright accusations, no mentions of threats or violence. Just unease, just a quiet, growing fear. Something had been brewing here long before last night. A forensic technician approached, pulling Brooks from his thoughts. He was holding a plastic evidence bag, his gloved fingers gripping it tightly as he extended it toward the detective. "We found this in the trash outside," he said. Brooks took the bag and held it up to the light. Inside was a damp, crumpled paper towel, stained with something dark, almost rust-colored. Blood. "Bathroom trash?" Brooks asked. The technician nodded. "Tucked under a pile of tissues, almost like someone was trying to hide it." Brooks's eyes narrowed. It was a small detail, but an important one. The murder had been violent, a bloodbath. Yet the crime scene had been eerily clean, except for the immediate area around Denise's body. No bloody footprints, no smeared trails, no signs of someone leaving in a hurry. Whoever had done this had taken their time. Had they cleaned up afterward? And if so, why had they left the bloody towel behind? He glanced toward the living room, where Carlos still sat, silent and unmoving. He hadn't spoken much since his initial statement, hadn't cried, hadn't asked any questions about what would happen next. A 17-year-old who had just lost his mother in one of the most violent ways imaginable, yet he showed no visible grief. That wasn't normal. "Run tests on this," Brooks ordered. "Check for a mix of DNA. I want to know if it's just the victim's blood or if there's something else." The technician nodded and disappeared down the hall, leaving Brooks alone with his thoughts. The inconsistencies in Carlos's story were piling up. He had said he'd been asleep when the attack happened, but the bloody towel suggested someone had tried to clean up. The muddy shoe found outside contradicted his claim that he never left the house, and Denise's own words, her unease about her son, lingered like a shadow over everything. Brooks knew better than to jump to conclusions. The worst mistake a detective could make was to let assumptions cloud judgment, but everything he was seeing pointed in the same direction. Denise's murderer hadn't come from the outside. The house had been locked. There were no signs of struggle. The attack had been swift, methodical. It had come from within. But if Carlos had done this, he wasn't acting like a typical killer. There was no panic in his demeanor, no nervous attempts to explain himself. He was too calm, too detached. Brooks exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. The truth was here, buried somewhere between Denise's final fears and Carlos's silence. Now it was just a matter of uncovering it. The house was no longer just a crime scene. It had become a puzzle, every room holding a piece that didn't quite fit. The sun had risen over Inverness, casting an eerie glow through the blinds. But inside, the investigation had no sense of time. Detectives moved with purpose, combing over every inch of the property, searching for something, anything, that might explain the horror that had unfolded just hours ago. Detective Daniel Brooks hadn't left. He had seen enough murder cases to know that time was the most valuable asset. The first 48 hours could make or break an investigation, and this one was already filled with contradictions. Every step forward only led to more questions, and every answer seemed to breed another layer of doubt. His eyes lingered on the evidence board that the forensic team had started piecing together. A printed copy of Denise Hallowell's chilling notes was pinned at the center, surrounded by crime scene photographs, the bloody towel found in the trash, the muddy shoe discovered near the fence. And yet the most important piece was still missing: the murder weapon. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide it. That alone suggested calculation, premeditation. This was no sudden burst of rage, no crime of passion, where a weapon was discarded in a panic. This was something colder, more deliberate. Someone had taken the time to remove the murder weapon from the scene, and Brooks needed to know why. A forensic analyst approached, holding a tablet. "Detective, we've got the preliminary results from the blood sample on the towel." Brooks turned his attention away from the board, his body tensing slightly. "And?" "The blood is Denise's, but there's a second contributor. It's weak, not a full sample, but we're running additional tests to see if we can match it." Brooks inhaled slowly. That was enough. He didn't need a name yet to know what it meant. Someone else's blood at the scene, someone who had tried to clean themselves up. His gaze drifted back toward the living room. Carlos still sat in the same chair he had occupied since the police arrived. His body was a statue of silence, unmoving except for the occasional twitch of his fingers against the armrest. He had barely spoken, hadn't asked any questions about the investigation, hadn't demanded to know who could have done this to his mother. A 17-year-old boy had just lost the only parental figure in his life, but there were no tears, no anger, no fear, nothing. That was what unsettled Brooks the most. A knock at the front door broke the tension. Another officer stepped inside, carrying a plastic evidence bag. "We just got this from the lake," he said, handing it over. Brooks took the bag and turned it over in his hands. Inside was a hatchet, its blade rusted and caked with mud, the handle smeared with something darker. Blood. His pulse quickened. This could be it. The officer continued. "A local fisherman found it near the shoreline. Said he almost tripped over it in the shallows. We'll run it for prints, but judging by the condition, it hasn't been in the water for long." Brooks felt the weight of the weapon through the plastic. The shape, the size, everything matched the forensic team's initial theory about the murder weapon. Someone had tried to get rid of it, not far from the house, not in some hidden location miles away. Just a short distance behind the property, as if they had panicked, but not enough to take it far. His mind raced through the implications. A stranger wouldn't have done this. A stranger wouldn't have come into the house, brutally murdered Denise in her sleep, and then taken the time to carefully dispose of the weapon just outside the property lines. This had to be someone who lived here. The room was silent as Brooks studied the evidence. There was a method to every crime, a pattern beneath the chaos. Murder wasn't just about violence, it was about motive, opportunity, psychology. And this crime, despite its savagery, had a strange clinical precision to it. Not professional, but controlled. He looked back at Carlos, still motionless, still distant. Brooks had seen guilt before. He had seen grief. He had seen killers who regretted their actions and those who didn't. And the way Carlos sat there, detached from the storm unraveling around him, was unlike anything he had encountered before. He turned back to the forensic analyst. "Run the blood tests on the hatchet. Get me the results as soon as possible." The analyst nodded and disappeared into the hallway. Brooks knew they were close. Everything was beginning to align. The missing weapon, now found, the blood-stained towel, the muddy shoe, the notes from Denise, documenting her growing unease. It all pointed in the same direction. But there was still something missing. A confession, a breaking point, a moment where the silence would finally shatter. And Brooks had a feeling that moment was coming soon. The atmosphere inside the house had changed. The crime scene was no longer just a collection of evidence. It was a ticking time bomb. Every passing minute brought the case closer to its breaking point. Detective Daniel Brooks could feel it. The tension that had started as an eerie stillness now coiled into something sharper, heavier. The truth was waiting just beneath the surface, suffocating in the silence, and it wouldn't stay hidden for much longer. Forensics had delivered a series of revelations, each one pushing them closer to unraveling the mystery of Denise Hallowell's murder. The bloody towel found in the trash bin carried two DNA contributors, Denise as expected, but also an unidentified second source. The muddy shoe, matching Carlos's size, had been found outside despite his claim that he had never left the house. And now the missing murder weapon had resurfaced, a hatchet pulled from the shallow edge of the lake, its blade still dark with dried blood. Brooks stood in the temporary command post the police had set up inside the house, staring at the crime board where every critical detail was pinned in sequence. Denise's name was in bold print at the top, her photograph placed beside the one of her son. Beneath them were the puzzle pieces, the laptop notes, the towel, the shoe, the hatchet. Each one was a brick in the foundation of a case that was coming together faster than anyone had anticipated. The issue now wasn't whether they had enough evidence. It was about forcing the truth to the surface. Carlos remained seated in the same spot he had occupied for hours, his posture unchanged, his expression a carefully constructed wall. He hadn't asked for a phone call. He hadn't asked for food. He hadn't asked for anything. Most people who were innocent, who had just experienced something as traumatic as the brutal murder of a loved one, responded with raw emotion. Grief, confusion, anger, even desperation to help find the killer. Carlos had shown none of that. Not once had he questioned what the police were doing. Not once had he asked if they had any leads. Brooks had interrogated enough suspects in his time to know that silence was rarely just shock. Silence was calculated. He exhaled, glancing at the time. It was past noon now. Nearly 12 hours had passed since the initial 911 call, and they were on the verge of something critical. The forensic team was still running tests on the blood from the hatchet, but Brooks already knew what they would find. The final confirmation wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. What mattered now was timing. The best way to get the truth wasn't always through evidence. It was through pressure. He turned away from the board and walked back toward Carlos, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't sit down. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch, filling the space between them like an invisible weight. Carlos didn't look up. His fingers twitched against the fabric of his jeans, a barely noticeable movement. But Brooks saw it, a crack in the armor. "The thing about blood," Brooks said finally, his voice calm but steady, "is that it never really disappears." Carlos didn't react, but Brooks wasn't expecting him to. He kept going. "You can wash it off your skin, you can scrub it out of fabric, you can even try to hide it, but under the right light, with the right tools, it always leaves a trace." Still nothing. Brooks let that sit for a moment before continuing. "We found a towel in the trash. Someone tried to wipe something clean. The test results just came back. There's two types of blood on it. Carlos's jaw tightened, a minuscule shift, but enough for Brooks to register. He took a slow step forward. "We also found your shoe," he said. "Outside, near the fence. Covered in mud." Silence. Brooks studied him. "We pulled something else out of the water this morning. A hatchet. We're running tests now, but I think we both know what they're going to show." Carlos's hands twitched again, just slightly. He was unraveling, piece by piece. Brooks didn't push further. Not yet. He didn't need to. The weight of the truth was already pressing in, suffocating, relentless. For the first time since the investigation began, Carlos shifted in his seat, his shoulders curving inward ever so slightly, his gaze lowering to the floor. It wasn't a confession, not yet, but it was the first sign of a crack. Brooks turned and walked away, leaving the silence behind him. There was still more work to do, but they were closer now, closer than ever, and it was only a matter of time before the dam broke completely. The walls of the interrogation room were bare, the fluorescent lights casting a sterile, almost clinical glow over everything. It was a stark contrast to the storm brewing beneath the surface. The air was thick with tension, unspoken truths lingering like a fog waiting to be burned away. Detective Daniel Brooks sat at the table, his hands resting flat against the cool metal, his gaze steady. Across from him, Carlos Hallowell sat rigid in his chair, his fingers interlocked so tightly that the knuckles had turned white. This was it. The weight of the investigation had been pressing down on Carlos for hours, layer by layer, wearing him down. The evidence was stacking up. The towel, the shoe, the hatchet, every piece pointed in one direction. He knew it. Brooks knew it. But what mattered now wasn't just the proof. It was the moment where silence would no longer be enough. Brooks had seen this before. The way a suspect fought to hold on to their last shred of control, clinging to a version of reality they wanted to believe. But the truth was an unstoppable force, and sooner or later it demanded to be acknowledged. A clock on the wall ticked away the seconds. The sound was faint, but in the stillness of the room, it felt deafening. Brooks leaned forward slightly, his tone measured, calm. "Carlos, we've been talking for hours now." He let the words settle, giving them time to sink in. "And I've given you every chance to tell us your side of the story. But here's the thing. Stories don't hold up when the evidence tells us something different." Carlos didn't move. His breathing was controlled, but there was something in his posture, something in the way his shoulders tightened, just the slightest bit, that told Brooks he was listening. Brooks glanced at the folder in front of him, flipping it open with deliberate slowness. Inside, crime scene photos stared back at them, frozen moments of brutality captured in high definition. Denise's bed, soaked in blood, the discarded towel, the shoe caked in mud, the hatchet pulled from the water, its handle still smeared with something dark. He didn't push them across the table. He didn't need to. Carlos knew what was in that folder. "The blood on the towel," Brooks continued, his voice even. "It's not just your mother's. There's a second contributor. We're running additional tests now, but I think we both know what they're going to tell us." Carlos's fingers twitched, almost imperceptibly, but Brooks caught it, a hairline fracture in the dam. "And then there's the hatchet." Brooks let the words settle. "The same size, the same shape as the wounds on your mother. It didn't get there by accident. Someone put it in that lake." A long, suffocating pause. Then for the first time since the interrogation began, Carlos moved. Just slightly, his hands unclenched, his posture shifting, as if the weight pressing down on him had finally become too much. Brooks didn't fill the silence. He let it stretch, let it pull tighter around them. Because this was the moment, the breaking point. Carlos exhaled a sharp, shallow breath. His fingers hovered over the edge of the table, his gaze locked onto some distant point beyond the walls, as if he were staring at something only he could see. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Just the beginning of something, a confession waiting to be spoken. And Brooks knew. This was it. The truth was about to spill free. The room was unbearably still. Carlos Hallowell sat across the table, his breathing uneven, his fingers twitching against the cool metal surface. For the first time since this all began, something had cracked inside him. The silence that had once served as his shield had become a prison, tightening around him, suffocating him. Detective Daniel Brooks knew this moment well. He had seen it before. The instant where denial could no longer hold against the weight of truth. It wasn't just about evidence anymore. It was about gravity, inevitability. Carlos exhaled, his body curling slightly inward, as if bracing for something unseen. His voice, when it came, was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that." Brooks didn't react outwardly, but inside a switch had flipped. Carlos wasn't denying anymore. He was explaining. Brooks let the silence stretch for a few seconds before speaking, his tone careful, neutral. "Tell me what happened." Carlos's gaze remained fixed on the table. She wouldn't stop. The pressure, the control, everything had to be her way." His fingers tightened into a fist. "I couldn't take it anymore." The words came haltingly, a mix of resentment and something that sounded dangerously close to relief. Brooks leaned in slightly. "So what did you do?" Carlos swallowed hard. "I didn't plan it. Not at first. I wanted her to stop. I wanted her to listen to me for once." His breath hitched. "But she never did." Brooks remained silent. Carlos's jaw clenched. "She took my phone. Said I didn't deserve it. Said I was wasting my life." His voice grew tighter, more strained. "She said she regretted everything. Regretted adopting me." Brooks knew better than to fully trust the words of a suspect trying to justify their actions, but he also understood that, in Carlos's mind, this moment had been building for a long time. "I just wanted to scare her," Carlos whispered. "I swear. I just wanted to make her stop talking, stop looking at me like that." His eyes flickered up for the first time, hollow and unfocused. "But then, I couldn't stop." The confession spilled out in fragments. He had taken the hatchet from the shed earlier that day, holding it, feeling its weight in his hands. The thought had been there before, buried beneath layers of frustration and anger. But that night, when Denise went to bed after their latest fight, something inside him had shifted. He had stood outside her bedroom door for what felt like hours, listening to the rhythmic sound of her breathing, the quiet rise and fall of her chest. She was so unaware, so sure that she was in control, and then the rage had taken over. The first strike had been tentative, uncertain, but after that there was no turning back. Carlos's voice faltered, his breathing shallow. "I didn't feel anything when I did it," he admitted. "No fear, no regret, just quiet." The room felt colder. Brooks took a slow breath, his expression unreadable. He had seen many killers try to explain away their actions, try to frame their violence as something beyond their control. But there was something unsettling about the way Carlos spoke. Not with pride, not even with remorse, but with a kind of detached finality. A crime of passion was messy, fueled by emotion. But this was something else, something far more chilling. Brooks stood, his chair scraping against the floor. Carlos didn't move. Outside the room, the case was already in motion. The forensic results would confirm what they already knew. The hatchet was the murder weapon. The blood on the towel was Carlos's. The muddy shoe was his. The final puzzle pieces had fallen into place. There was no doubt left. Denise Hallowell had feared something before she died. She had sensed the change in her son, had written it down in quiet desperation, perhaps knowing, too late, that something was deeply wrong. Carlos had given them the last piece of the puzzle himself. The truth was in the blood, and now there was nowhere left to hide. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.